In 1899, in a provincial town softened by gaslight and dust, the night often settled before people were ready for it. Candle flames leaned and trembled as if listening. Ledgers lay open on desks, their pages smelling of ink and old decisions. Outside, cobblestones held the day's warmth just long enough to release it slowly into the dark. It was the kind of place where nothing seemed hidden, and yet everything important was kept carefully out of sight. The photograph was taken in such a town, on a day that felt ordinary enough to forget, but important enough to preserve. It was small, sepia-toned, its edges already beginning their quiet surrender to time. A family stood posed in a garden that no longer exists, framed by an iron fence and hedges trimmed into obedience. Behind them rose a house with tall windows that stared forward unblinking, as if it had learned long ago not to react to what passed inside. At the center of the image stood a woman with her hands neatly folded, her posture trained by expectation. On her finger, a ring caught the light with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as though the sun itself had been instructed where to look. Even now, the ring draws the eye first. Gold has that authority. On the back of the photograph, ink had bled through the paper in places, names and dates pressed hard enough to leave an impression. Ownership was claimed in careful handwriting, each letter formed with restraint, as if the truth itself needed to be handled gently. In that year, photographs were not casual things. They were promises. They claimed permanence in a world already beginning to slip into modern speed. A photograph said this moment mattered, that these people were arranged correctly, that what stood before the lens deserved to endure. This image was meant to celebrate order, marriage, inheritance, respectability. The ring was its quiet proof. Gold meant legitimacy. Gold meant safety. Gold meant the future had been secured in advance. But objects remember more than faces ever can. The ring shines too brightly, almost interrupting the image, refusing to blend into the polite harmony of the scene. It feels like a detail pressed flat, a story forced into stillness but never fully silenced. In the ledgers of a town registry, the marriage appears unquestioned, written in lines as straight as the morals they pretended to reflect. In church records, the vows are neat and approved, signed off with practiced certainty. Everything official agrees with everything else. And yet when the photograph is studied long enough, another presence begins to emerge. At the very edge of the frame, partially cut away by the photographer's decision or by design, there is a second hand, barely visible. Hovering close to the ring as if once it belonged there. It is not positioned with pride. It does not claim attention. It lingers uncertain, caught in the act of being erased. Servants were not meant to appear in photographs, neither were debts of conscience. The camera captured what society wished to keep still, not what trembled beneath it. In large houses like this one, servants learned early how to move without leaving traces. They mastered the art of presence without acknowledgement. They handled the private objects of other people's lives while remaining absent from their public stories. Their hands lit the lamps, carried the letters, folded the linens, and cleaned away evidence of emotion before it had time to harden into memory. If they left behind anything, it was usually silence. Somewhere between the shutters' click and the ink drying on the back of the photograph, something was taken. Not stolen in the way courts recognize, but removed with permission granted by power. Quietly. Lawfully, without witness. The ring did not begin its life as proof of respectability. It had been promised earlier, under circumstances never meant to be recorded. There was no garden then, no iron fence, no assembled family. There were corridors instead, long and dim, where footsteps echoed even when no one was there. There were doors that closed softly and conversations that did not require witnesses. In those spaces, promises could be made without consequence, because consequence required acknowledgement. When the ring changed hands the first time, it was not accompanied by vows, only by expectation and imbalance. That story did not fit neatly into ledgers. It could not be hung on a wall, so it was folded away like so many other truths until it was no longer considered dangerous. When the ring returned to the light, now cleaned and sanctioned, it told a different story, a safer one. The photograph survived fires that consumed whole blocks of the town. It survived sales, passed from one set of careful hands to another, wrapped in cloth and stored in trunks that smelled of cedar and dust. It survived silence, which can be more destructive than flame. For years it lay unseen, waiting without intention. Time moved forward as it always does, carrying the town with it. Gaslight gave way to electricity. Cobblestones were covered. The garden disappeared. The house remained, though altered, its windows still watching. and still the photograph waited. Every time it was rediscovered, it was handled gently, admired briefly, then returned to its place. People commented on the clothing, the posture, the seriousness of faces unaccustomed to smiling for such devices. They admired the ring. No one asked where it had come from before this moment. With every passing decade, the gold continued to glint, catching new eyes, asking the same question without words. History has a way of speaking through repetition. The photograph's surface stayed calm, its lie perfectly composed, but beneath it, tension remained like pressure held too long. Objects do not forget. They simply wait. The ring waited. It waited as names were spoken with reverence and others were never spoken at all. It waited as the woman in the photograph lived out the life promised to her by that moment, believing or choosing to believe in the story the ring told. It waited as those who had touched it first learned to survive without acknowledgement, carrying memories that could not be framed. It waited as the town congratulated itself on its order, on the smooth running of things, on the absence of scandal. Respectability is often built from absence. Absence of questions, absence of noise, absence of those who might complicate the picture. The photograph asked nothing aloud. It did not accuse. It simply existed, refusing to decay completely, refusing to release its hold on the light. When it rested in drawers and trunks, it shared space with letters never sent and documents no longer needed. Paper remembers pressure. Ink remembers intention. The careful handwriting on the back of the photograph pressed through, leaving marks that could be felt by fingertips long after the words themselves faded. Even then, the truth remained restrained, bound by the same forces that had shaped it. In the quiet of storage rooms and attics, the ring's reflection dulled slightly, then brightened again when touched by a new generation's curiosity. It became an artifact, then an heirloom, then an archive item. With each transition, its meaning shifted, though no one yet knew how. The second hand at the edge of the frame remained partial, unresolved, a fragment that refused to disappear completely. It suggested that the photograph was not as complete as it claimed to be. That it had been cropped by choice, not accident. That something essential lay just beyond what was permitted to be seen. Photographs promise permanence, but they are built on decisions. What to include, what to exclude, what to center, what to sacrifice. This image chose order over truth, harmony over honesty, and yet it could not fully erase what it had cut away. That is the danger of documentation. It freezes a moment, but it also preserves its fractures. Long after the town forgot the circumstances of the photograph, long after those involved had been buried under stone that praised their virtues, the ring continued to interrupt the image. It continued to shine too brightly. It continued to suggest that gold, for all its beauty, is often heavy with other people's losses. The photograph waited patiently for the day when someone would look long enough to notice what did not belong. When someone would feel the faint impression of ink through paper and wonder why the handwriting was so careful. When someone would see the second hand and ask whose it was. Until then, it remained what it had always been, a promise and a question. Who paid for this gold and who was erased so it could shine? The house in the photograph belonged to a man who never raised his voice. His words were measured, weighed before they were released, and trusted because they arrived without urgency. In 1899, that calm carried authority. It suggested control. It suggested fairness. People believed men like him because belief made life simpler. His ledgers were always balanced, columns aligned, numbers reconciled at the end of every month. What did not balance was never written down. Reputation in that world mattered more than truth. Respectability was not simply social approval. It was currency. It bought silence. It bought patience. It bought the benefit of the doubt long before doubt was ever allowed to form. Certain voices were welcomed in drawing rooms and council meetings. Others were useful only when they stayed low and quiet, when they moved through the edges of rooms and left no mark behind. The house itself reflected that order. The front rooms were bright and disciplined, filled with furniture chosen to signal stability. The back corridors were narrower, dimmer, and always in motion. Beyond the garden and its trimmed hedges, those corridors whispered. They carried footsteps late at night and early in the morning. They carried instructions that never needed to be written down. A maid moved through them with practiced invisibility. She learned when to lower her eyes and when to disappear entirely. She learned the sound of every door and floorboard. She handled linens that carried the warmth of other people's bodies, letters sealed with intentions she was not meant to know, silver polished until it reflected faces that never reflected her. These objects were heavy with other people's lives, and she carried them all. Rumors followed her like dust. They settled quietly and were never spoken aloud. In that world, silence was not innocence. It was survival. To speak was to risk everything. To be quiet was to endure. The ring did not enter her life with ceremony. There was no chapel, no witnesses, no public promise. It rested first in a different pocket, brought out only when the corridors were empty and the house was asleep. It was shown, not offered, promised, not pledged. There were no words that could be quoted later, only implication and power. The gold felt heavy because it carried expectation, not protection. When the ring changed hands, it was framed as generosity, a gift, a solution, a necessary correction to disorder. That language mattered. It turned imbalance into benevolence. It allowed the man to see himself as reasonable, even kind. Papers were signed afterward, not to record what had happened, but to prepare for what would replace it. A marriage followed, clean and proper. The town approved because the town benefited from believing the story as told. Order was restored. Discomfort was removed. The narrative aligned again. Injustice did not arrive shouting. It did not break doors or spill blood onto the floor. It settled instead into routines. It wore gloves. It spoke softly. It convinced witnesses that looking away was a form of politeness. People noticed the maid less and less. Her name appeared fewer times in household accounts than not at all. Her disappearance from payrolls was explained easily. Ambition elsewhere, weakness, fate, explanations that required no further thought. She became a gap in memory, and gaps are easy to live with. The photograph was taken after all this had been arranged. It presented the finished version of events. Its surface was calm, its composition precise. The lie was not obvious because it was not loud. It was perfectly composed. By the time the ring returned to the light, now officially sanctified, no one asked whose finger it had first marked. That question would have required disruption. Moral blindness was easier. It allowed the house to sleep well. It allowed its owner to move through town without hesitation, his authority intact, his conscience undisturbed by what he refused to name. Legality and virtue became the same thing in his mind and in the minds of those around him. That is how respectability protects itself. It smooths over seams and calls them design. The house continued its routines. Meals were served on time. Lamps were lit at dusk. Bells rang on Sundays. Life appeared orderly, yet the corridors never stopped whispering. Objects remembered hands that no longer touched them. The ring remembered weight before it remembered vows. History is patient. It does not argue. It waits. And injustice, once dressed as respectability, always leaves a seam, no matter how carefully it is stitched. It surfaced without ceremony, decades after anyone who might have been named in it could be made to answer. Folded carefully inside a parish ledger, misfiled among baptismal records where beginnings were meant to be celebrated, the letter waited in silence. The paper was thin, the kind used when resources were limited and waste felt like a sin. Time had softened it. The edges curled inward. The ink had faded to a pale brown, faint enough to seem hesitant, yet strong enough to endure. The words held. They always do when written with intention. The letter had never been sent. It had never traveled. It had never been folded for an envelope or sealed with wax. It had simply been placed between pages meant for other stories, as if hoping that one day someone looking for innocence would find truth instead. The hand that wrote it was careful, trained by repetition. This was not a hand that reached for flourish or drama. It belonged to someone accustomed to copying inventories, names, dates, instructions. A hand taught to record, not to accuse. From the first line, it was clear this was not a plea. There was no anger, no demand, just a quiet insistence on accuracy. Dates were listed, notations precise, promises described that did not align with the official story preserved elsewhere. The letter spoke of a time before the sanctioned marriage, before the photograph, before the ring was allowed to mean safety. It described the ring in simple terms, its engraving, its weight, how it felt when worn, how it carried both hope and warning at the same time. Objects often do. The ring was not described as romantic. It was described as heavy. The letter explained how gold can feel reassuring and dangerous in the same moment, how it can warm the skin while reminding the wearer of who controls its return. The words moved carefully as if stepping around something fragile. It spoke of a child, but not with sentiment. The child was noted the way one might note a change in weather or a shift in household routine, quietly relocated, taken elsewhere. Language used was administrative, not emotional. That choice was deliberate. Emotion could be dismissed, records could not. Money was mentioned but never called payment. It was described instead as charity, assistance, help offered in a moment of difficulty. Language has always been a tool of comfort for those in power. The letter exposed that comfort without naming it. It described a departure framed as choice but enforced by circumstance. The kind of choice that disappears the moment it is questioned. The most unsettling part was not what the letter revealed, but how it revealed it. There was no hysteria in the sentences, no plea for understanding, no request for forgiveness, just record. Calmness can be devastating when it leaves no room for denial. The letter did not ask to be believed. It assumed belief would come eventually, if only because time removes the need to protect anyone. When it was finally read aloud in the rectory, the room changed. Dust hung in the air, visible in the afternoon light. The walls, lined with portraits of past clergy, seemed to lean closer. The sound of the words filled the space more completely than any accusation could have. No one interrupted. No one cleared their throat. Silence settled heavily, not with shock, but with recognition. The ring in the photograph, long admired for its symbolism, was suddenly loud. Its presence echoed in the mind, no longer decorative but explanatory. The respectable man, named only indirectly in the letter, had died long before. He lay beneath a stone that praised his virtues, his generosity, his standing in the community. The stone had never cracked. It had never needed to. His lawful wife had lived a life of public dignity. She attended services, hosted gatherings, donated to causes that reinforced her image. Whether she knew the cost of her security or chose not to know, the letter did not say. It did not speculate. It did not accuse her. It simply allowed the possibility to exist uncomfortably without comment. That restraint was part of its power. The revelation did not arrive as scandal. There were no whispers spreading through town, no reputations torn apart in public. It arrived instead as clarity, like a room slowly lit by a single lamp. The underdog's dignity was not found in protest or confrontation, but in precision, in dates that matched, in descriptions that aligned. In a refusal to exaggerate, the oppressor's facade cracked not with guilt but with exposure. There was no apology written into the margins of history, no confession discovered too late, just truth placed where it could no longer be ignored. The letter did not need an audience beyond time itself. Time had done its work. The ledger was corrected. Margins filled with notes written by a different hand, one belonging to someone who understood the weight of what they were doing. The additions were careful. Respectful, too late to save anyone involved, too late to change outcomes, but not too late to tell the story straight. Corrections in ledgers are rarely dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They simply alter the record so that future eyes will see something closer to what actually happened. In that quiet act, something shifted. The photograph, once admired without question, could no longer be seen the same way. The ring could no longer be admired without context. House still standing seemed heavier in memory. The letter was returned to the ledger, but no longer hidden. It was catalogued, a note added to its file, a small acknowledgement that the parish had held more than one truth at a time. The rectory returned to its routines. Bells rang, services continued. But the silence after that reading was different. It carried knowledge now, the kind that cannot be undone. The letter did not bring justice in the way people imagine it. There were no consequences to measure, no punishments to observe. What it brought was alignment, a straightening of the record, a refusal to let the past remain entirely comfortable. Sometimes that is all history can offer, not repair but recognition, not redemption but remembrance. The margins of the ledger bore witness to that shift. Ink layered over ink, time speaking to itself. The child named without sentiment lived and died without ever knowing how close their origin came to being forgotten entirely. The woman who wrote the letter had likely done the same. Their lives unfolded without acknowledgement but not without meaning. Meaning arrived later in the hands of someone patient enough to read slowly. When the ledger was closed again, the room felt unchanged yet altered. The past had not been rewritten, it had been clarified, and clarity has a way of unsettling foundations built on omission. The truth did not ask to be forgiven. It did not ask to be celebrated. It simply stood finally visible, waiting for nothing more. Some names only find peace once the truth is spoken. The house did not fall. It was not destroyed by fire or scandal or abandonment. It was sold, quietly, paperwork signed, keys exchanged. Its walls remained standing as if nothing had happened inside them at all. Renovation followed, as renovation always does when a new era wants to believe it is separate from the old one. Walls were opened, floors replaced. Garden behind the iron fence was erased first. Hedges that had once been trimmed into obedience were torn out to make room for straight paths and modern lines. What had grown slowly was removed quickly. Progress does not like reminders. The windows were changed, but they kept their height. They still watched. The house learned new routines, new voices, new furniture. It absorbed them without protest. Houses are good at that. They remember even when they appear to forget. The photograph did not stay with the house. By then it no longer belonged there. Once it had been understood, it could not return to drawers or trunks. It moved instead into an archive placed carefully in a sleeve meant to protect fragile things. Its edges were stabilized, its surface cleaned just enough to make the details clearer, not enough to erase the marks of age. It lay flat under glass, no longer handled casually. Visitors paused before it longer than before. They leaned in. They traced the outlines of faces with their eyes. They noticed the second hand at the edge of the frame. They noticed the ring. The gold no longer read as celebration. It no longer suggested safety or order. It read as evidence. Evidence does not accuse. It simply exists, waiting to be understood. In some towns, bells toll for memory. Names are spoken aloud. Stones are touched. In others, silence does the work. This was one of those places. No service was held. No announcement made. The archive did not advertise its correction. The change unfolded slowly, through footnotes and catalog updates, through the quiet work of people who believed accuracy mattered even when no one was watching. Names were recontextualized. One gained an asterisk, a small mark that asked the reader to look closer. Another gained a line in a ledger that had waited nearly half a century to be written. The ledger did not celebrate this addition. It absorbed it as it had absorbed so many other truths, late but intact. The child mentioned in the letter lived an ordinary life elsewhere. They worked. They aged. They were known for small kindnesses and small flaws. They never knew that proof of their origin had survived, folded among church accounts, protected by the very institution that once helped bury it. Their life was not shaped by revelation. It did not bend under the weight of recognition. It unfolded without acknowledgement, and yet it mattered. Ordinary lives always do. When they died, they were mourned by those who knew them for who they were, not for what they represented. History did not interrupt them. It waited until interruption was no longer necessary. No trial followed the discovery. No court convened. No verdict was delivered. There was no apology read aloud at a graveside. The dead remained undisturbed. Justice in this case was not punitive. It did not point fingers or demand retribution. It was corrective. It adjusted the record so that the story could be told as it happened, not as it had been curated. That kind of justice is quiet. It does not satisfy those who expect resolution to feel dramatic. It does not undo harm, it acknowledges it. Sometimes that is the only form available. The ring remained gold. Its weight did not change. Its metal did not darken with shame. Objects do not feel remorse. But meaning is not fixed. It shifts as understanding deepens. The ring became a marker of imbalance, a symbol of how easily power can turn affection into transaction, how promises can be reframed as generosity when the scales are uneven enough. Visitors saw it differently now. They no longer admired it without question. They asked where it had been before the photograph. They asked whose hand had first worn it. They asked what had been exchanged for its shine. Photographs cannot speak. They cannot defend themselves or explain what they contain, but they endure. And endurance is a form of testimony. The photograph held its position under glass day after day. It did not change its expression. The faces remained composed. The posture remained correct. But the silence around it shifted. Silence, when informed, carries weight. The past does not demand spectacle. It does not ask to be dramatized or avenged. It asks only for honesty. Honesty does not shout. It settles. When the archive closed each evening, the lights dimmed and the halls emptied. The photograph stayed behind, unchanging. The ring continued to catch whatever light remained, softer now, filtered through understanding. The air around it felt lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Not because the past had been healed, but because it had been named. Naming has that effect. It allows memory to rest. Some visitors left unsettled, others left grateful. A few left indifferent, unable or unwilling to feel the shift. That too is part of the story. Not every truth changes everyone, but it changes the record. It changes what can be said without correction. It changes what silence means. The house miles away continued to stand. New residents moved through its rooms. Children ran through spaces that once held whispers. Laughter replaced restraint, at least on the surface. And yet the silence there felt heavier now to those who knew. Knowledge alters space. It lingers even when no one speaks of it. The house no longer held the photograph, but it did not need to. Memory had already been relocated. The ledger remained in the parish archive, its margins filled with notes that would never fade entirely. Ink layered over ink, each generation responding to the last. It was not perfect, it was not complete, but it was closer to the truth than it had been before. That mattered. The woman in the photograph was remembered differently now, not condemned, not absolved. Seen with more complexity than the frame had allowed. The man whose authority once felt unshakable was reduced to context, not erased but understood. Understanding can be unsettling. It removes the comfort of simple stories. The maid's name, once absent, appeared again in small print, not large enough to dominate the page, large enough to exist. That existence was the correction. That was the reckoning history could offer. Objects do not haunt on their own. They haunt when meaning is suppressed. Once understood, they stop haunting. They start remembering for us. They carry what we no longer need to hide. The ring, the photograph, the ledger, they became witnesses rather than accusations. And so the story settled into its final form, not resolved but aligned, not redeemed but recognized. The past remained imperfect. It always will, but it was no longer pretending to be something it was not. Some names only find peace when the truth is told. And some objects, once understood, stop haunting and start remembering for us.